Thank you all for coming down. Wow, standing room only. That's great. How many Kim Stanley Robinson fans do we have in there? How many of you have you read one or more of his books? How many of you read this latest one?
It's very new.
It's good.
Ooh.
It's very, very good.
We can blow the ending.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Well, talk about it. Actually, in your book, we are standing underwater. We would be underwater here, right?
Yeah, we would definitely be underwater here.
Tell us about what the premise is. You've drowned New York or part of it?
Part of New York, sea level rise. Can you hear me at the back? Is this mic'd up right? Okay, good. There's at least 3 seats, people at the back, if you want to slip in.
No fighting.
So I was helped a lot by a recent James Hansen paper with 18 co-authors. 120,000 years ago, the air temperature rose by about 1 degree average for the globe, and within a century, sea level went up 10 meters. And this was abrupt and inexplicable, so Hansen and his team tried to put together the case of how it had happened. And what they came up with is speculative. It's not quite science fiction, but it is science speculation, because it's very hard to determine where sea level was 100,000 years ago and how fast sea level rise might have happened when you're looking 100,000 years ago. But they put together this case that said it had happened because of ice on Antarctica that is perched more or less like it's perched now. And we've had the 1 degree rise in temperature already, and we're going to have more. So the case being made there was we're in for a way higher sea level rise, way faster than the IPCC reports and the general consensus is right now, as I was so firmly told this morning on Squawk Box by Joe Kernan, only 8 millimeters in the last 100 years. But so I postulated 50 feet of sea level rise by the year 2140 because I wanted this part of town underwater and turned into a kind of Venice. And I just went to a topo map of Manhattan, and I picked the 50-foot line, and I took a big red pen and drew it really hard all over the Bay Area here, the estuary, to see what would happen, and then I followed from there.
You know, in fact, we're going to have our educational department, Science Friday, right after we finish our conversation. We're going to have a demonstration of where the water would be in various parts of New York. So you hang out for that, and then we'll have questions and answers about it. You're a native Angelino, right, from Los Angeles?
Yes.
So why did you pick New York to submerge us? Yeah. LA's not deep enough for you?
Well, New York is more interesting.
Thank you and good night.
You could be from almost anywhere and say that, I love New York the way people who are not from here love New York, and that I don't have to deal with it. I just, I come here and I'm just on fire with the skyscrapers. I'm like the most hick of hick tourists. I have a tourist map in my pocket, and I'm always walking around like this, going, "Wow, the buildings are tall." And I'm from Davis, California, which I would claim is one of the most boring towns in the universe. So when I come here, I'm always loving it. And it occurred to me that I wanted to write a novel also about global finance and about essentially overthrowing global finance in my usual utopian revolutionary leftist style. And when I suggested that to my editor, he said, "That is a terrible idea, Stan. I don't want to hear that ever again." And I said, "But I want to do it." And so he said, "Well, if you're going to do it, can't you put it in New York? Because that's Wall Street, and then I can at least have a chance of selling that book." So it was my editor's idea, but I thought it was a grand idea, and I came back a lot trying to do the research for it. And I've been here a lot through the years because it's the home of publishing, and I'm a Dodger fan, and I like New York.
From Brooklyn.
Yeah.
So in the book, it's described as a super, just so you get an idea of what New York is like, it's a super Venice. A lot of canals and things. The city does not collapse. That's an interesting tack that you've taken. It doesn't collapse. It doesn't go away. It just learns to adjust like Venice did.
Yes. I'm not sure this is how it would play out, but I don't think people will ever abandon New York. And the truth is that Upper Manhattan is considerably higher than Lower Manhattan, which I had not bothered to check when I wrote 2312. So I just had all of Manhattan drown. Well, that just isn't how it would play out. And once I got serious about it and I got the topo map out, the line of Venicification is downtown. And at a midtown around the Empire State Building, it gets higher than 50 feet above sea level. It stays that way all the way up to the cloisters, are about 220 feet above sea level, with a big dip at 125th Street. And a lot of Harlem would be underwater. A lot of Brooklyn and the Bronx would be underwater. Hoboken would be out of the water, but the meadowlands behind it would be an inland sea. So I played the game, and it's partly a science fiction game of just what would happen. And whether it would play out that way or not, I have no idea.
Now you know why we call it Washington Heights here.
Yes, and Brooklyn Heights.
Brooklyn Heights here.
Exactly.
And you actually did go around the city, measuring different places.
I definitely did. I took a tourist map and I marked it up the same way as my USGS topo, kind of tracing the one to the other, because a tourist map is a crappy map. But it was in my pocket, and I took it around town, and I thought, well, what would it look like? Because the tides also are about 10 vertical feet in the estuary. And so that would mean parts of like 6th Avenue, 5th Avenue, there's several blocks, about 10 blocks. At high tide, it would be up near the Empire State Building, but at low tide, it would be like 10 blocks further south. So that intertidal zone turns out to be legally and infrastructurally problematic, biologically problematic. It's easier to live in a Venice that's wet all the time than it is to be in a tide zone between high and low tide. And legally, following Roman law, which determines a lot of English and American common law, the intertidal can't be owned by anybody. So suddenly you have a whole ton of buildings that are on land that can't be owned. So I figured lawsuits would proliferate.
And you do talk a lot. I feel like sometimes when I was reading the book, Rod Serling was one of my great heroes as a writer, because when he did The Twilight Zone, CBS told him he couldn't do any more socially relevant stuff that he used to do in the 50s.
Okay.
And so he hid it in The Twilight Zone. They're all socially relevant stories. And so you've sort of woven into your story the finance system, the financial world, and how changes that you thought need to occur without giving anything away about the end.
Oh, we can give it away. People know, these are my readers, they know what I'm going to do. I'm going to cause another revolution. And but what's interesting is if global finance is in control of the world economy, late capitalism, whatever you want to call it, and ordinary people are in the precariat, and there's the 1%, there's what we now call income inequality, because Americans can't say the word class. And it's probably better to say income inequality to be more exact about what's going on. How do you overthrow that in a practical plan? Well, it needs finance. It needs to be financed. It involves a kind of jujitsu move where following the crash of 2008, you can model the 2008 crash as something that, instead of happening by accident, by people who promised that they could pay that couldn't pay, crash the system, you do it on purpose as a strike, fiscal noncompliance. But you have to have the replacement plan in place. So you don't just do it and then have things fall apart. You do it, and then when the banks and investment firms come screaming to Congress and the Fed for somewhere between $7 and $15 trillion we gave them. We gave them 100 cents on the dollar after they blew it gambling. And that's how we responded, because the people making the decisions at the public level were Goldman Sachs executives turned into public executives. The plan would be to save them by what we did with GM and nationalize the banks. So nationalize the banks is a very simplistic kind of like slogan, bumper sticker, but yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah. Well, you know, in New York there is a plan. I think it does exist to actually build giant floodgates and things like that to keep the water out. But you chose not to go in that direction. Why? Why?
Well, the floodgate plan won't work in the technical sense of the Dutch wouldn't approve of it, and they don't do that themselves with the Rhine River coming in through, or whichever big, maybe it's the Elbe River coming through Amsterdam and Rotterdam. They let the rivers pour on through, and the polder areas around it. And so in New York, what the plan is, and Bjarke Ingels, the Danish architect who now is based in New York, has been given the job of designing a barrier wall that is simply Lower Manhattan. It's about 12 miles long, goes down the west side and back up the east side and up into Central Park, that wouldn't interfere with ordinary Manhattan life, but could stop the big surges like the Hurricane Sandy, plus 5 feet, 8 feet, whatever. And so they conceive of this barrier as being perhaps 15 feet tall. But if you have a 50-foot sea level rise, then you have the occasion for disaster. And there was once a plan to put a dam down at the across the East River, and dam the East River at Hellgate and down near the Williamsburg Bridge, and simply fill in the land in between, connect Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens. I reckon it was about 2,000 acres of new real estate, and then lots of streets, and it was a totally cool plan.
That wasn't Robert Moses, was it?
It wasn't,
No.
although
No.
Good that Robert Moses didn't hear about that.
Still be there.
In my book, I have a great comment from Robert Moses, 2 of them. When they tore down the aquarium in the Battery that was very, very popular, he suggested that they take the fish and either throw them into the bay or else make a chowder, a big chowder. And then the other thing he said was, I don't know if people really deserve the Hudson.
You have, I'm glad you brought that up, because you have wonderful quotes at the beginning of each chapter that I can't tell if they're real or not.
Oh, they're all real.
They're all real. Wow.
Yes.
People said some of those things.
Well, there's only one of them not real. I made it up myself. The invisible hand never picks up the check. But most of them are just lines from Ambrose Bierce or New York Stories. A lot of them are from an excellent book that is probably for sale here called Capital, from Verso Press, edited by Kenneth Goldsmith. And it's nothing but New York Stories, quotes and little anecdotes. About half of my stories come from that one book. I wrote to Goldsmith and Verso saying, can I please give you credit? And Goldsmith said, don't you dare give me credit, because I stole every one of my quotes, and I have no credit for mine. So he believes in fair use as a kind of aggressive policy.
Right. The Hudson River is also a big player in the book.
Well, it's
beautiful.
I couldn't believe it when I understood the geological history of the Hudson, and there's a reason why it's the mighty Hudson. There's a reason why it's not a river, it's a fjord, or a fjord, as the geologists would be very picky about this. They like to twist the language to be specific. So it's a fjord, but at the end of the Ice Age, when the ice cap was over North America, and many of you probably know this story, but I did not, and it blew my mind. The Hudson River Valley was a lake, a finger lake, and it stopped at the Battery, and there was hills crossing that made it nothing but a lake. But all those lakes, like Lake Missoula, covered Montana and broke out and went down the Columbia River Gorge and scored the Scablands in a gigantic flood, and there were gigantic floods down all over North America as the big ice cap melted. Well, there was one down the Hudson. When it finally broke free, it cut the Verrazano Narrows, and it cut that gigantic submarine canyon that runs all the way out to the continental shelf, all the way out to the abyssal plain. So
they dumped the garbage.
It's all clear out there, all the way out to the old Waldorf Astoria, which they dumped out there also.
Yeah, you reminded me of a story. Years ago, I interviewed one of the last architects of the George Washington Bridge. He was in his 90s, and I was talking to him about the Hudson River. And I said, the George Washington Bridge has more traffic than any other bridge just about in the world. You built it in 30s. How did you get across the river without the bridge? And he thought for a second. He said, well, in the winter, we walked across.
Oh, yeah.
Shows you how the climate is.
It's an awesome thought to think about the polar vortex hitting, especially Venice. You would be walking again, but it would be ice.
You also, in your book, this was an interest. There's so many little interesting tidbits in the book, but you talk about trying to save. There's a woman who operates a dirigible, and she flies around the world trying to save endangered species. And one in particular that you focus on is moving the polar bears from the North Pole to the south to Antarctica.
Yes.
And there's a great pushback against that happening.
Well, it's a little crazy and a little disconcerting if you think there are people who are very fond of the idea of Antarctica as the last wilderness, the last pure place on Earth. They're kind of purists in general, and it's easy to be that way in Antarctica because nobody's there. And I feel that it's an extremist position that doesn't do us any good because it's just an accident that nobody's in Antarctica. It's covered with ice, and it's hard to get to the oil down there. And it doesn't matter if you have a McMurdo, if you have 5,000 tourists a year. There's objections even to that it should be kept empty of people. There's a kind of Puritanism in the deep ecology wing of the environmental movement that I don't approve of, and I call myself a shallow ecologist to distinguish myself from the deep ecologists. I think what you need is to stop extinctions, and whatever it takes. Even zoos, but for sure assisted migration, which is what the biologists call this notion that we begin to manage and finesse and interfere with the natural world in order to keep things from going extinct until hopefully we suck some carbon out of the atmosphere, cool things back down, and I don't believe we'll ever get to restoration. We're on a mongrel planet that we've mongrelized, and now what we would like to do is avoid the mass extinction event. So I have some characters thinking, let's put the polar bears on the shores of Antarctica. The ice will stay down there for, even at the fastest melt rate, we've got 5 to 10 to 50,000 years of ice on Antarctica. The polar bears would have a place to live because every winter the sea ice down there is really extensive. And of course the Weddell seals, the penguins, they would be hopelessly out of luck since they don't even know what a polar bear is. Putting a top predator in an area where the top predators right now are leopard seals and killer whales, it's a little crazy, and yet I could imagine people deciding to do it. And then I could imagine people getting very angry and wanting to resist it, to have it be a point of contestation. Because that's the way we are, right? Contestation is like our main thing these days. But assisted migration is feeding into a thing that E.O. Wilson has been talking about in his book Half Earth, that we began to create gigantic habitat corridors in North America. And since humans are abandoning places like the middle of Spain or Montana, North Dakota, places that were terrible for normal agriculture, that we go back to buffaloes and wolves, we go back to bison, we began to do some landscape restoration and wildlife restoration. I find it very exciting as a avoidance of a mass extinction event. But it is very mongrelized, very human, very hands-on. It's not wilderness. And so it's controversial.
Do you think your book has come out just at the right time? I mean, here you have Scott Pruitt, the EPA administrator, questioning the role of human activity on climate change. I mean, is your book a warning about what can happen, or are we at the tipping point that it's going to happen?
Well, since I finished the book, I read a new paper coming out because of these Argo ocean monitoring systems, these buoys that are out there in the ocean now just floating around randomly, and every once in a while they go ahead and sink and get a reading from a kilometer down, and then they come back up again. We know much better than we did even a year ago what's happened to ocean temperatures. And just like about a third to a half of the carbon dioxide that we've poured into the atmosphere is in the ocean and has acidified the ocean to a measurable degree, the temperature rise that we put into the atmosphere has warmed the oceans to a measurable degree, like something like 11% more than we thought the oceans were warmed up. They are warmed up. And so some glaciologists say there's nothing we can do about it. We are looking at substantial sea level rise even if we were to decarbonize right this very minute. Others are saying, well, how do you know? There's models, and you pick the figures in your modeling exercises, and then you run a spread. And so there's a lot of choices being made. And in fact, one of the hosts of Squawk Box was very angry at this morning because there's only been 8 millimeters of sea level rise in the last 100 years, and why would I say 50 feet? And yet the IPCC says at their highest projection, and these are really conservative estimates, by 2140 they say 15 feet. And I want to say that in scientific terms, 15 feet and 50 feet are the same thing. And that's because they're within a standard deviation of each other. And if you could get a 15-foot rise, it implies that a couple more valleys slipping into the sea, or something going on in West Antarctica that happens rather dynamically and unpredictably by modeling, because you could get 50 feet if you are admitting that you could get 15. So I'm talking about something that we've already initiated, and whether we can stop that or not is one of these, that's for science fiction writers to deal with. I don't know. I'm just a literary realist of the most literal, realistic kind.
If you live in Florida or even in Atlantic City, you've already seen the ocean rise affecting you.
Well, and Florida is so low. It's astonishing how low Florida is. I mean, for a peninsula that big to be that low with one tiny little ridge that's like the cloisters, like Upper Manhattan, and not much bigger, down the middle of the state, sticking down from Georgia, but most of it would be underwater. It's kind of a strange geological feature.
Yeah. You talk about it. The rising of the water not happening all at once, but you've given 3 what you call pulses, right? 3 different. How did you choose that? What are the pulses?
Well, that is quite speculative on my part. But I spent a lot of time as a backpacker on glaciers for the fun of it, and I read about them as a armchair activity in the winter time when I'm not backpacking. And glaciers are often they're frozen to their beds, and so they move rather slowly. Gravity moves them, they break like ice cubes, and they get down there and they calve off into the sea. But if they begin to melt at the top, the water drops down moulins, and they get down to the bottom, and suddenly there's the glacier has ground the granite or whatever underneath the substrate so fine that you get something like toothpaste, or even just a plain water thing. So the glacier can then slide rather than grind. And in those slidings, there can be a quick jolt downstream, and you see this some Alaska glaciers, there's some famous stories, and then they hit an uphill, and they kind of stick for a while. So what I postulated, and this is partly because, and I have to admit, it was a literary necessity that I have sea level rise kind of pause for a while, or else how could I have my super Venice? So I was thinking I needed to jolt and pause, and there's a little bit of precedent in the activity of individual glaciers. So I have to admit, a lot of this is back engineered from what I want for my story. And then I think, can I get that with a plausible explanation?
I always wondered about how science fiction, right, or any journalist or novelist write. Do you know how the story is going to end and then work backwards when you write your story?
I sometimes do, yes. I'm doing that right now in a novel about China taking over the moon, and I know the end of the story.
Back up for a second.
Well, I mean, I finished this New York novel last April, so that's almost a year ago, and ever since then I've been working about a novel in which China quickly takes over the moon, which I will put this prediction out there. They're going to do that. It's easy.
Does that mean colonize it when you say take over?
Well, I mean, you go to the moon is useless except at the north and south poles where there's water ice. So they take over one pole, and this is kind of an old Mao thing, lean to the side. You don't offend the rest of the world while you're conquering them, just do it. So I think they would take over one pole and leave the other one to everybody else so that people wouldn't be freaked out. And I don't mean take over in any sense except you set up a base, you start doing science.
It's like Antarctica is now.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's no recognition that anybody owns any land.
Right. And the Outer Space Treaty, which everybody's signed off on and is abided by, even the the Chinese are very good at treaty compliance compared to us. But the Outer Space Treaty is based on the Antarctic Treaty, so they have the same attitude towards non-ownership. But you can send a scientific base anywhere you want.
Do you have science fiction writers or people that you grew up that are iconic to you that you believed in and you love to read? And who would they be?
Well, the ones who I truly love are the new wave generation, great New Yorker Samuel R. Delany, and another New Yorker, Joanna Russ. I love them. And then Gene Wolfe, Midwesterner, and Ursula Le Guin, another Californian, and kind of for a lot of us, she's the great mama, the one between her environmentalism and her science fiction and her brilliance. She's been an important figure for all of us, Ursula. And then I want to go back to another New Yorker who's really been important, is Isaac Asimov. Because when I was a kid, Isaac Asimov was just the most clever and entertaining. I loved his works, his short stories, and his idea that the world would be best if it were Manhattan everywhere. You know, that's a real vision.
When you live in the penthouse in Central Park, you can say that.
Yes, yes. Although he began to suffer from agoraphobia, so not only was he good on New York, but he wasn't comfortable if he wasn't in, like, the subway. So he wouldn't leave that apartment in overlooking Central Park, and became quite an agoraphobic. And his book, The Naked Sun, is his best novel because a guy goes into an absolute fit of terror at having to go outdoors. And I think Isaac felt that personally.
And he also created the 3 laws of robotics.
He did.
Are they being violated now in science fiction? Or
No, they're
do
so.
we have to rewrite them?
Well, they're so brilliantly written that they just stand like they're behavioral laws that you can play with forever.
But one of the what was law number 1 or 3 that a robot will not attack its creator.
Right.
But
Right.
we're now seeing the fear that AI is going to get smarter than we are.
Yes. Smarter is a strange word to use because it's so vague. Science fiction, let me talk first about how I think science fiction works and then get back to AI because I don't want to forget this point. I think science fiction is like 3D glasses at the movies. There's 2 lenses involved. And on one lens, you are really trying to predict the future, saying this is going to come. And so that has the power of prophecy, like your Isaiah or Jeremiah. And these science fiction writers that say, well, it's not really about the future, it's about the present. I'm thinking, why would you say that? There's a power to saying this is what's going to happen that has to do with prophecy. It's a very ancient power. It's like being a shaman. Why would you give up on that? But also, the future can't be predicted, so you don't want to be only that, or you become a futurologist, which is to say a kind of bullshit business consultant. So the other lens is indeed a metaphor that it's saying that people are becoming like robots, they're not going to be happy. Zombies are people who've lost their pensions. It's like the middle class. You're Walking Dead. You know, the precariat is, we're all zombies. That's why you're interested in zombies. Vampires are obviously the 1%. They suck your blood. They live off of you. They're parasitical. They only come out at night. So everything in science fiction is a metaphor for the conditions and situations right now, all the big tropes, so that a space station is a city, and on like that. Well, AI, and this is important, is science. Science is that artificial intelligence that we are modeling when we talk about artificial intelligence. No one person is as smart as science or can know what the AI knows, which is faster and more crowdsourced and more data rich and more everything. And so it's a metaphor. Our fears of AI are a metaphor for our fears of science, taking control. There was a post-World War II fears that these eggheads in lab coats were going to take over the government even. It was scary stuff to have the scientists take over. So I think that's what AI, our worries about AI are expressing a current fear that we've lost control of history, that it's technological innovations that we're not in control of that are making all the changes in history, and that we've been lost. We've been bypassed by the machines. But what they really mean is science. And the better you know science, the more you're thinking, well, that's not going to happen because science is just a bunch of human beings getting out there and wrangling with data. It's very improvisational. It's very political. It's not magic.
Then how do you explain somebody like Stephen Hawking who knows something about science, being one of the great proponents of thinking that we're going to lose the race with AI? That be careful, be afraid, be very afraid of these smart robots.
Well, I will say that emeritus physicists, when they begin to talk about other subjects, they are just as bad as the rest of us. They're not good on politics. They're not good on philosophy. They're, he figured out how black holes release radiation. It's brilliant stuff. And so you get physicists that are actually quite good on other subjects, like Einstein, like to a certain extent Richard Feynman, and then you get physicists who are brilliant physicists who are quite terrible on these things, like, I don't know, Watson or
Linus Pauling.
Linus Pauling, or our wonderful Stephen Hawking. Why should he worry about the AI when we can pull the plug on it? Or it doesn't do what brains do. It's actually quite insufficient to what brains do. So it's an astonishingly fast calculator, but since we don't know how the brain works, and that's an interesting question to get into, as what's consciousness and how does the brain work, there are barriers to our understanding there that might last forever. Then I don't think you need to worry about AIs taking over, because how would it manifest? So it's a science fiction story that I think is a little lame. It's a kind of like a political fantasy.
Wait, is this, are we in some sort of universe?
We are co-authoring a science fiction novel called 2017, and it's getting pretty weird. Philip K. Dick would be laughing.
Do you know how it ends? Are you writing backwards here a little?
I wish I could. No.
Well, speaking of, you brought up that you were on CNBC this morning.
Yeah.
On a business program.
Yeah.
Do you think that science fiction writers can make headway in influencing the direction of the way people think in government or in business, or have them think more carefully about what's going on?
It's not that direct. It's more culture at large. What I think happens is that everybody's a science fiction writer, not only in just making our current moment, but in their personal lives. When you're doing things that you hope will make a better situation later, like going to college or whatever, you're a utopian science fiction writer. You do certain things, you get to a good result. When you're fearful, when it's the middle of the night and you don't have enough biochemicals in your brain and you're thinking everything is doomed, then you're a dystopian science fiction writer, no matter what we're doing. And there's an apocalyptic strain to that we all get into. And so we're always both. So what people rely on science fiction is it's not any one writer. It's all of us as a community writing a whole bunch of stories that contradict each other, but they make a kind of consensus future that everybody begins to think we're going towards that. And the more science fiction you read, the more you realize it's like weather modeling, in other words, completely inaccurate, or it's like modeling in general, where it begins to spread out the further you go in the future, so that it's not particularly accurate, but it does give you a sense of whatever happens next, you're not going to be surprised by it, because it's one of many stories that you've already told to yourself. In that sense, science fiction is important, because the more you read it, the less surprised you are, and the more you have a sense, I want to do this now to get to a good future.
Yeah. Well, we're going to not take a break. We're going to do a little project now. Ariel Zich is going to come up. She's our Science Friday education manager, and over in the office at Science Friday all day, all this week, we have been putting together a little community project we can all do here to talk about how deep the water in New York City area would be running. Cool. And we're going to show you with fun and games. Ariel's going to come on up. It's Ariel Zich, everybody. She's sort of lost her voice. I'll give her, you have your mic? Okay.
I'm usually much more charismatic, I swear. No, so we've got some staff who have envelopes that have a location on them, and they're going to pass them out as I explain to you a little bit about what we're going to do. It's going to take just a few moments. It won't hurt.
I love this.
Bring One World Trade this way, please. Same with Dumbo. So I'm going to make you guys One World Trade. Make you friends over here, Dumbo. Battery Park is going to be kind of this middle back area. And actually, Brandon, the Strand bookstore people, everyone's standing. You get to be members of the Strand bookstore. And then I'm actually going to pass Riverside Park back to you. Everyone should get one cute little lollipop-looking thing. It'll just take a moment. So at Science Friday, we do a lot of education. You guys all know that if you've heard Science Friday, but we also do it for little people. And the challenge that I face as the education manager is how to take really complicated things, or even really simple things, and make them accessible to younger minds, right? So you guys have hopefully been around the block a little bit. You've at least stayed alive long enough to read long science fiction novels, right? Some younger people haven't done that. We need to give them a sense of perspective, both in terms of magnitude and also in terms of the passage of time. And so for something like climate change and ocean level rise, here, I'm going to hand these ones out too, yeah. The big thing, yes, keep passing the mountain. Pay attention to what location you have. The big challenge is really giving them a feel for it. And unfortunately, 200 years in the future doesn't always do that. Fortunately for us, a lot closer time frames they get, and they're also more accurate when it comes to things like climate change. So the federal government, as you know, makes a lot of predictions, especially now that they're in the flood insurance business. And what we're gonna do is gonna visualize actually what their prediction is for the year 2080, specifically for this region. So this is what you guys are holding are data points. And these data points represent what they think a Hurricane Sandy is going to be like in the year 2080. So what I'd like you to do, especially as you guys are getting, let's start in the back. If you've got a lollipop in the back, can you unroll it, take the tape off and unroll it and wave it around a little bit so the people up front can see what you've got. This is not how high the sea level will rise in the year 2080. It's already 6 feet higher than it is now. This is actually how deep the water is gonna be when you step outside your front porch in each of these locations. So how much do you have back there, guys?
Unroll it.
Not a whole lot. Okay, so if I'm looking at Riverside Park, maybe?
Oh, yeah.
That's a Strand? Oh, perfect, Strand. Great place to store books. All right, that's perfect. So you got a couple inches, it's gonna rain, it might be big puddles. It's gonna be a wet weekend for you, not a big deal. Let's go a little bit more downtown, or a little more uptown. I guess, do we have any Riverside Park out yet? Perfect, so wave if you're kind of in that middle region, it should look like a few feet.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's nice. So you can have a little swimming pool party. Actually, Riverside Park, it's gonna get a little rinsed. It's gonna get washed away, but 3 feet's not a big deal, right? And the actual park is on a slope. So as long as you kind of walk your dog a little inland, you'll probably be fine. That's good. So what do we have over here? I think Battery Park. Ooh,
Oh, dear.
I'm a little worried. Battery Park, go ahead and stand up. You're probably gonna have to stand up a little bit. If we've got any brave souls who want to stand on their chairs.
We're not insured for that.
You're not quite sure. Oh, there we go. We got some brave people.
Don't hit those light bulbs.
So at Battery Park.
That would happen, man. Electricity would be in.
Yeah.
At Battery Park, we got about 9 feet of water.
Wow, that is deep. And he's still unwinding.
Yeah, and this is really not that far away. This is in like 60
deep is
years.
that?
That's 2 mortgages,
9
right?
feet of water
9 feet.
on a 6-foot sea level rise in general.
I'm going to have to get up here with you, Mr. Robinson. I think,
That's
to get
fine.
these guys
Do
up.
your thing.
Okay, let's see what the folks at One World Trade have got. Yeah, those folks down here.
Holy
And
moly.
Dumbo, if you want to stand up and give us your Dumbo
Oh, my
data.
gosh. That'll be even deeper.
So Dumbo is looking at 11 feet.
Wait a second. I got to take
And
a
I'm
picture.
sorry, at One World Trade, you guys are going to have to stand on each other's heads because you've got 14 feet
Don't do that.
of water. If you look at the room, the ceiling height in this room is about how deep the water is going to be in this part of Manhattan. This data is not terribly controversial. This data is so not controversial. Yeah, right. Well, if you ask the people with money, speaking of finance, right? If you ask the people with money, like Allstate Insurance, this data is the reason they got out of the business of flood insurance. All right, so this data is the data that just in the year 2016, they said this is a very conservative estimate for what's gonna happen.
Yeah, which it is.
All right, now you guys can go home and have a blue theme party if you'd like.
But don't go home yet.
But don't go home
No,
yet. No,
not
you're
yet.
gonna stick around for questions. But
Do we have anybody else left who didn't get up and unwind?
Yeah.
Unroll?
You can take this home and show your
Lost
friends this is
neighborhoods.
how deep the water is gonna be. And we did they did something similar to what Stan did.
Yeah.
I have to call you Stan because I'm obsessed with you.
Call me Stan.
Okay, Stan. This is similar to what Stan did, right? They take a map, a topographic map, and they say 6 feet of sea level rise, and then add some wind and rain to this Hurricane Sandy-like situation. And what's particularly frustrating about this is Hurricane Sandy, when it happened here in 2012, it was a 260-year flood. So using sediment analysis in the harbor, they said, something like this hasn't happened in 260 years. By the year 2080, where all of this data comes from, if your house is in one of these places, you have an 89% chance of seeing this level of water in your 30-year mortgage. That means if you buy a house in Battery Park, you have an 89% chance that before you're done paying that house off, you'll have this much water in your basement.
And what's amazing about that is we're not talking about where you can't imagine that in your family. If you have children or grandchildren,
Yeah,
this is a real thing now.
that's exactly right. So we don't have to go that far to get impressive data for children, and that's kind of one of the things we do. We have a resource on our website. We do this stuff all the time because we want to get that data out there, and we also want to show people who's using it Cough, cough, the federal government. Okay.
Thank you, Ariel.
Yeah.
Ira
Yeah.
Zitch, everybody.
Yeah. One of the things I learned in my research for this book is there was an unnamed hurricane in 1893, perhaps, that had a storm surge of 35 feet, and Sandy was something like 12.
Is that right?
And what it was explained that I didn't know before, being a Californian, is as a hurricane comes north, it's spinning counterclockwise, and help me if I'm blowing this, but I think so that the wind is pushing west as it comes north, the high-speed winds. A big slug of water gets pushed into New Jersey and through the Verrazano Narrows, but also down the Long Island sides, coming also from that direction and through the Hellgate and into the East River. Meanwhile, the Hudson River continues to pour a massive watershed, something like 250,000 cubic feet per second at its normal flow, and it keeps pouring so that there's nothing but water coming in. There's no way out. And if you get one of those moon tides,
Right.
then the path of least resistance is up. So that's why you get this area with amazing storm surges.
Yeah, we've seen that. Now we're going to open up to questions. Do we have a mic going out there, or are we just here? We do. Somebody.
Well, you're getting a mic. I want to add one thing to this demonstration. Apparently, the Queen's Museum has a topographic 3D map of the metropolitan region, which I have not yet seen because my New York friend won't take me there. I want to see it bad. Well, put a hose in there and fill it up. Check it out. That would be fun.
Well, the Montefiore, Columbia University, years ago published a map of what New York would look like in various years of flooding. Okay, questions. Yeah. Who's got it? Right here. Start off with this lady right here.
When you were researching the book, did you draw at all on the Manhattan Project? And I'm asking in part because when Sandy flooded us, it reclaimed the original shoreline in a way that was uncanny, almost as if we've borrowed the space.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a reminder we're going to have to give it back. So I wonder if that informed
Explain with that.
Yes, I can explain it, and I did rely on it. And it's kind of a beautiful story for me. An ecologist, Eric Sanderson, who had done his work at UC Davis, got a job with a NGO doing wilderness work in New York City. And when he came out here, he decided that although he was an outdoors guy, that the New York region was worth an ecological study, and that's a book from Abrams, an art book, with computer recreated maps and artistic demonstrations of what the island, it focuses on Manhattan, but it gets the rest of the area, what it looked like before Europeans arrived, and then goes through the stages of it, but always as an ecological space, not just an urban history. There were hills that got chopped down, there were ponds that got filled in, and it goes on and on like that. Well, this was a absolutely important book for me in and of itself, but also for research for my project. And it became the Manhattan Project, a kind of a website and a communal project where you can go around. And this will be a great eco-zone, a great act of landscape restoration. It's only just begun, but the theory is there. And as far as practice, wild animals will be happy to come back here. So it's something to look forward to, I think.
Do you get any, since you're an Angelino in Los Angeles, do people ask you, well, what is LA going to look like in the book? Or how far inland? What's going to disappear in LA?
Well, very few places. The beaches will be gone. I'm from Orange County, and so it's part of Los Angeles, really. It's part of that basin. And I was a beach kid when it saved my brain as a youth. And it makes me very sad to think that all the beaches in the world are doomed. It's a beautiful ecological zone, and it's a beautiful culture, beach cultures. Well, they're simply doomed because a very trivial sea level rise, the beach is simply sea level. It's at the tide lines. Between the tide lines is where the sand gets created by the churn of waves. So that's all gone. So I've been thinking about landscape restoration in that respect. That sand will be underwater, maybe 5, 10, 15, even 50 feet underwater, whatever, it'll still be there. And we're very good at dredging sand. We got the barges, we got the dredges. So I'm thinking, I did this in my book on Coney Island. massive amount of sand, is move it on up into Brooklyn to about, I think it was F Street, I can't remember the names of the street, F Avenue, and you dump it there and restore the beaches. And it was Robert Moses that discovered that if you had 1,000 workmen and they each planted 1,000 pieces of dune grass, you suddenly had a dune grass stabilization. So landscape restoration, it's labor intensive, it's beautiful, it's a full employment program.
Creates jobs.
Yes, creates jobs.
Okay. Yes. Let's go there and then back up to here. Right, just
Let's see
hang on.
Especially if that mic works.
Okay. Speaking of Orange County, how do you think your work since the Wild Shore has evolved to where we are today? Because you're now much more political.
Yes. Well, The Wild Shore was my first novel, and I would say, don't bother to go back that far in my work, but I would also say that by the time I got to the Gold Coast, which is the second of 3 Orange County futures, each one of them different, and after the fall, a dystopia, a utopia, which is Pacific Edge, I would still stand by and recommend the Gold Coast and Pacific Edge, and then if you're interested in juvenilia, then you could read The Wild Shore too. But it's really the Gold Coast that's already political. In that book, one character says, we use weapons as a drug. And then another character later says, we use drugs as a weapon. And it's really about the combination of the drug culture and the defense industry culture of Southern California, which I saw both up close and personal. So I was politicized by my college French professor, Frederick Jameson, and by being a hippie in the late 60s and early 70s and having a draft number of 89 and various personal reasons that makes one political in one's youth, and then you never change.
That will do it.
Yeah.
I was 318, so.
Oh, you in good shape.
I was in good shape. Bring the mic over here. While we're moving the mic, in your book you talk about new ideas and new technologies, and one of them is building floating islands or attaching
Yes.
floating. That's possible.
Well,
You're creating new real estate to build on.
yeah, like houseboats built big. A Manhattan block is a relatively, it's smaller than a container ship, or maybe not. I'm making that up.
There are houses in Brooklyn that are smaller than.
Anyway, especially in the intertidal zone and especially in Midtown, which is built on landfill rather than on bedrock, those buildings are in terrible trouble and the tides will wash them out. And then you can never really rebuild there again well. So what you would need at that point is to maybe anchor, to float, to go up and down on the tides with an entire Manhattan block, and then hang in there so that Manhattan stays Manhattan.
Like a floating dock.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, exactly.
This may be covered in the part of the book that I didn't get to yet. If so, I'm happy to wait and read about it. But I can't help thinking, how does the electrical grid survive under all that water?
The electrical grid, they have to harden it and waterproof it. A lot of the electrical grid for New York already has underwater segments and runs in the subway tubes. And
we know about the L train, so.
yeah, it would be. I don't mean to diminish it. Essentially, almost all of the infrastructural problems are modeled on Venice's solutions. So Venice has to deal with this stuff. They have dealt with it. Sewage, that's a problem. Water supplies and electricity, but it can be done. And so I have a minor attention paid to that, especially distributed grids and photovoltaic power being shot back into the general system and then used as needed.
Back in the back. We'll come back here. Yeah.
There's great books probably in this store by Kate Asher called Building and Works about how a city works and how a building works.
Thank you. In the internet era, we seem to be more able to become encapsulated in these little information bubbles and become anesthetized. As we extrapolate in the future, do you think this means that we're going to become less and less able to agree on what reality is and therefore how we should even respond to our challenges?
It seems possible. What you suggested seems possible to me. The fraction, I call it in my book 2312, I call it balkanization. The balkanization of so that there won't be mass culture as we understood it, say, in the 1950s, where there were 5 movie stars and there were 3 newspapers and 3 TV channels. Balkanization. And there are some hopeful things in balkanization, bioregionalism, local culture, the fact that nobody can really keep a good security check on you. You know, in terms of surveillance, consider the worst surveillance of all, your credit rating. Well, in a balkanized world, it might be less and less possible to keep a citizen score on you, like in China, or a credit rating, which is a fantastic breach of personal information that we all accept. So yes, I think it's getting weird because of the internet and because of balkanization.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a science fiction story to tell, by the way, that I recommend that you try, because when I think when most people try it, kind of your brain explodes.
Hey, your brain seems to explode a lot. I mean, and that's
but
not in a good sense.
No,
And how do you decide what you're going to focus on for your next book? Why choose this over that, or all these ideas running through your head?
That's a hard question because I don't know. I guess I just follow my instincts as to what seems interesting. And also, I never make the mistake I made in my book, 40 Signs of Rain, for which I thank you for reading and apologize. I try to keep my books outdoors. No more books where 90% of the scenes are meetings inside rooms in Washington, D.C. That was a dangerous move, an experimental novel that, you know, like most experimental novels, it's painful to read.
Wait for the mic.
Thank you. I recall reading that you were in China not too long ago, and I was curious what you thought of the, for lack of a bird, the scene there. And you met, what's it, the writer of the 3-Body Problem series?
Yeah.
I was just curious. I just read the just the bare bones of what happened, so I was curious what you thought of the visit and what happened.
I went because of this China Takes Over the Moon novel, and I had never been to China, and I had written The Years of Rice and Salt and never been to China, so I felt a little like I better go to China. So I did. And I went to Hong Kong, Chicago, and Beijing. And in Beijing, they arranged for a new Chinese translation of Red Mars. And now that's something that really does thrill me, is translations of my books, to be published while I was there. And it turned out to be the same publisher as Liu Cixin, a great Chinese science fiction writer, maybe the Asimov or he's kind of like Arthur C. Clarke written by Philip K. Dick, if you can imagine that. So he's impressive, and he's a computer. He runs a power plant out in the countryside and writes his science fiction on the side, which I find maddening.
Hope he's watching the dials.
Nice guy. Yeah, he said, well, he said, I have more time to write. They closed down my plant. It was a coal plant.
I'm sorry.
So we had an event together. It was an extravaganza. We had simultaneous translations, so I knew what they were talking about. And it was a beautiful moment. Really a sweet man who was modest and smart and funny. And a 3-Body Problem. I recommend it to you.
This gentleman right here. Then we'll go back there.
Hi. Actually, I guess the question I have relates to Years of Rice and Salt. It's actually the first novel of yours that I read and gave many copies away to friends and family members. How do you think telling stories about the past is relevant for your more futuristic aspects? Because I mean, it feels like there's a message there, and I think with what you did with Shaman.
Yes, well, thank you for that. I think science fiction is a historical literature, and actually to finish what I was saying about the 2 lenses of science fiction, prediction and metaphor, what you get when the 3D pops is history, is deep time. And that's what science fiction provides you, is a vision of deep time that's projected forward rather than backwards. But it makes it a historical literature. And I love history with all my heart. I was a history major until I became a literature major, and I still read it for fun all the time. And Hilary Mantel is like a god, and it goes on and on like that. And I had the alternative history is where science fiction talks explicitly about how does history work. And the only reason an alternative history is always found in the science fiction section is because of this structural similarity. You take a moment in the past and postulate a change, and you get The Man in the High Castle, or you get The Years of Rice and Salt. And I thought I had the best idea for an alternative history that I could possibly come up with, which was that all of the Europeans died in the Black Death. And then world history went on for 700 more years. And the questions become, where then did the scientific revolution come from, if there were a scientific revolution? But the Chinese were already quite scientific in some ways, and so were the Indians with their mathematics. So I had it happen in Samarkand as a kind of a trading scientific revolution, just like in the West, based on the metallurgists who were making swords. Better cannons, better swords. It was a military thing from the start, science. But then the other question, where did the feminist revolution come from? Which seems to have come from Western Europe in our time. Where would it have come from without Europe? And there I looked to Fatima Mernissi and the Forgotten Queens of Islam, the whole feminist strain of Islam that is under-recognized given its modern manifestations because of the Hadith. So that's alternative history. Then, when you're writing about the future, you have this question, what will human beings become? And the question that immediately has to follow that, well, what are we? So, and that determines what we might become. So you get into sociobiology, you get into archaeology in the deep past, and we know way more about what humans were like 30,000 years ago than we did 30 years ago. It's been a stupendous amount of new knowledge and information about not just the Neanderthals and how we're all 3 to 5% Neanderthal, which makes for some interesting stories, but also the cave paintings at Chauvet, which is what I wrote about in Shaman. So I think them all of part of the same project. I think of those as science fiction novels, both Shaman and Years of Rice and Salt. But that's partly being a science fiction patriot. Really, you could make it a bigger thing and say that's what literature does.
Sounds to me like you spend more time researching than writing. I mean, you have to know.
No, I spend more time writing.
What's a writing day like of yours like? What's a day like?
I get up in the morning, I send the family and off to work and school, make the breakfast, send them off, and then I go out into my front yard courtyard, and this is one rather signal advantage of Davis, California, Mediterranean climate. And I work outdoors on my novels, and I work until I get hungry, and then I usually quit and garden, or I garden first and then write. It depends.
Does the gardening help you formulate stuff?
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah?
I would say gardening is crucial and writing outdoors is crucial for me personally. The gardening, I get my hands dirty and I sit out there in the sun and I began to wake up and I began to think and I began to get a little itchy and antsy and I kill a whole bunch of weeds and feel very aggressive. And
do you get writer's block at all?
I don't want to get writer's block. So I tend to kind of say it's better to write 5 pages of total shit than it is to not write at all. So I just forge through. And I do write a lot of crap, oh my God. But I'm a big reviser. So when I'm writing first draft, I write about 3 hours a day and then my brain is toast. If I'm doing revision, I revise from when I wake up in the morning until I fall asleep at night, 7 days a week for 3-4 months. My family gets irritated with me. And I like revision a lot because the text begins to get better and better. And at some point, without ever having done it myself, I'm looking at a text that is, well, it's like, who did that?
It's interesting about your writing, and in a lot of your books, you step out of character.
Yes.
Step out of character, say, if you want to know the plot, get to the end of the chapter. Skip this. I'm going to talk about this development here or there.
Well, there's 2 things going on there. I love the idea that novels are not personal testaments. They are more like the 1940s telephone operator that's taking those cables, plugging them in. It's more like what you do on your show, which I love. And you take voices, you plug them in, and you orchestrate, which you're great at the orchestrating, which I know from being one of the people you plug in. But for a novelist, I plug in voices, I try to get them in the right sequence. I don't want to be there. One of the reasons I love the Years of Rice and Salt more than I love, say, the Gold Coast, is that the Years of Rice and Salt, as far as I can tell, I'm not there, and I'm writing about stuff I don't even know anything about. Where does it come from? I don't know. I just do the revisions, and I hope for the best. But novels are not about personal expression. They're about being a voice of the community. So, that's the way I see it. Then, in terms of exposition, expository lumps, every narrator should also be a character. Maybe like the third wind in Shaman, or Kartophilus, the guy from the future that's telling Galileo's story in Galileo's Dream, which is another historical fiction, very fictional. So the narrator's a character that isn't me, like the citizen in the New York books. Well, I'm from California. Why this sarcastic, profane, motor-mouthed New Yorker was appearing on my pages, I cannot tell you, because I don't even hardly know anybody like that. But I'm an American, and I know there must be New Yorkers like that, right? So.
Not in this room.
Well, I watch Turner Classic Movies, so I.
If you're going to make a film out of that, then you would have to make sure that the character is a motor
Well,
mouth.
I think so. But I argue for the expository lump, which I don't want to call it that, but this is what workshops call it. Or they call it the info dump, because there was a movement in writing workshops in the 1980s, mostly the cyberpunks, my dread enemies. And what they wanted to do was show that fiction was just a toy that they had completely figured out, like Tinker Toys. So they had disparaging names for everything. Excitement was called eyeball flicks. And exposition was called info dumps. And they were so cool, and I hated them. And so what I said was, we don't know how fiction works, and don't be narcissistic about it. Oftentimes the stage business, if you want to use a term, the stage business of people talking to each other or a car crash is a total cliche, whereas the exposition, where you're describing the world or the estuary or something that isn't human interaction and isn't a dramatic scene, is better than or more interesting than the rest of it, or at least equal. Exposition, I'm arguing for the equality of exposition at least, if not the superiority at certain. And then also I often go to Gabriel Garcia Marquez. 100 Years of Solitude doesn't have a single dramatized scene. It has single lines that people have spoken, but it doesn't have any dialogue in it whatsoever. It's entirely told, not shown in American workshop terms. So all the MFA programs are wrong, including my Clarion workshop. All of the supposed internet consensus, like if you go to the customer comments on Amazon.com, everything that people say about fiction is wrong. And I only say that because none of us knows what's going on. You start reading lines of fiction and it's like you've fallen into a dream, a waking dream. And what I would say is it's more like time travel and telepathy, to put it in my genre's terms. The time travel is you get to go see what it was like when Henry VIII was chopping off the heads of all his wives. That's Hilary Mantel, the time travel. And then it's telepathy. You're inside the mind of Leopold Bloom or Benji or Holden Caulfield. That's the telepathy, is you get to be inside other people's consciousnesses, which is very, very rare experience for all of us. So both of these are fictional experiences, but that's the power of fiction.
There was a question over here, yes.
A comment and then a question. I'm scandalized that you chose 50 feet, the imperial measure, not something in meters. And
Oh, yes.
and bummed in particular because the front step of my apartment building in Queens is 49 feet above sea level.
At the title zone, oh my Lord.
And I didn't know, and I haven't read the new book, so I didn't know that until you mentioned it just here.
Yeah.
Well, I read Antarctica recently. In those early chapters, when the main character is on the aircraft, I thought to myself, this guy's been there.
Yeah.
He's been on those planes. And then in the afterword, I saw that, oh, yes, you have actually been there. There are a couple of mentions of China, and I was thinking, does this guy speak Chinese? Do you?
No.
Oh, or you've picked
No.
up, when you mistranslated the names.
Yes, I can play games with what I read in English. And there are some very, very good books on Chinese culture that give you their wonderful, pithy language in pinyin so that you can pronounce it and see what it says, because it's in, our alphabet.
But the names.
But that's about it.
The names. And
Yeah.
then, has the Years of Rice and Salt been translated into Chinese, and how did they take it?
It has been, and it's going to be retranslated and republished, so there is interest, and I've gotten hardly any feedback. Every once in a while, I've gotten some very positive feedback, like saying, oh yes, this is definitely what it must have been like back in the Qing dynasty. I'm thinking, well, how do you know? So, but it's been there's an intense interest, I would say, but it was—
In China?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah, I've gotten royalties even, which means that it means it has to have sold quite a bit.
No one stole it.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the next one. I'm wondering how the Chinese will receive it. I heard a quote at least 20 years ago when the American space program was completely in the doldrums. there were Americans saying that the next time an American lands on the moon, he will have his passport stamped by a Chinese customs official.
Yes, I think that's very likely. And I will also say how the Chinese are going to accept this book. I was told in no uncertain terms while I was there, and this is basically by publishers' representatives who are interested parties, saying no matter what, and you know how the Chinese like their numbers, like the two whatevers. This is like the guy that followed Mao, I think he said, whatever Mao said we're going to do, and whatever Mao's decisions were, we're going to do. So that got called the two whatevers. And there's the four, the Eight Noble Truths. I mean, there are many, many, many numbered things. So in this case, there's the three T's. Whatever you do for this novel, for us to make it be big in China, because they're going to love this novel, you can't mention the three T's. Tiananmen Square, Tibet, and Taiwan. And so I'm thinking, I'm going to have to start this novel saying, you can't mention the three T's, and go on from there. Because that is not the focus of my book, to get by Chinese censorship. I'm going to see what I can do. Because why not? I'm an American. I don't even speak Chinese. There's no way I'm going to. This is the whole problem of censorship. You pre-censor in order to, get things done. I don't want to do that.
Any other questions out there? Yeah, this gentleman right here, and then we'll come up here.
You spoke about the beach earlier, and there's a really moving scene at the end of your last book, Aurora, where characters, having spent far too long in space, find themselves on a beach somewhere. And it's actually a beautiful passage. It's very sensual. It's very rugged. They're doing a bit of reclamation here. To me, that's actually a wonderful and poignant way to conclude about what it means to live in the world, to inhabit a world, even if it's a devastated world. So one question I have for you in the new novel is, when you're projecting this out, did you see or envision new ways of relating to the earth coming into being? Do your characters find new ways to live in this environment? And how do they relate to it metaphysically, spiritually, things like that?
I would like to do that in almost every book now. It strikes me as important. I have 2 children who, as far as I can tell, have dived into their laptop screens and escaped the world. And it's a cultural thing. And we all spend way too much time indoors and focused on screens. And the world outdoors is simply more interesting. It has more pixels, it has more possibilities, and it's such a beautiful experience. So that was the end of Aurora, and that will be many of my books. What it struck me about China, especially how environmentally damaged that place is right now, which is quite extraordinarily bad, so that the fact that America had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the things that we did to clean up the United States in the 70s have paid off hugely. And when I grew up in Southern California, I was in a fog of lead such that when I took a deep breath, it actually hurt at the bottom of my lungs. And when I was in Beijing last fall, that parts per million for the 2.5 micrometers or nanometers,
right.
Those very small particles, where 30 is dangerous and 25 is as high as you ought to get, and 300 is extremely dangerous. The day I was there, the weekend I was there, it was 450. And you could crunch the air between your teeth. And you could see it at night. It was white. By day, it was black. Well, if China were to move some of their manufacturing off to the moon, and that's sort of like the metaphorical part of science fiction, of saying if they were to clean up their manufacturing, then they could do landscape restoration. So I think landscape restoration is one way to talk about it. E.O. Wilson's Half Earth is another way to talk about it. Assisted migration. This project that we have as a civilization to get into a sustainable balance it's a moral project, but it's an aesthetic project. It's like an Andy Goldsworthy. Wilderness has kind of gone away because the atmosphere is everywhere and we've trashed the atmosphere. But that's okay because we can do something that is close enough to wilderness to be the best we can do given what we've got now. So as much as I love my wilderness adventures, and I do love them, I don't think that's a crucial term to use anymore compared to these other terms. The mongrel world, but that's sustainable and beautiful. So, and that story can be told in many iterations, although happily I only have a couple more novels to go, and then I can head for the Sierras.
You had a question? We'll get you
And
the mic.
we'll have time for
One
more
more,
after.
last question.
Okay.
I have 2 questions.
I might think I'm a school teacher.
We
here.
can do that.
Okay.
I'll be brief.
Okay.
That's what Henry James said once, which cracks me up.
What is like the best advice that you can give for an aspiring writer?
Well, for aspiring writers, I would say gather with a group of like-minded friends and make a workshop group of your peers. And don't do it in classes, do it in peer groups where you, once you've got 10 people reading your story, you're published, and then you've got an audience, and you begin that reiterative process of trying to make your work better. And then also let things hang around for a while and revise them. Do a lot of revision until you get things as good as you can, as far as you can tell, and then let go and move on to a new story. And don't get caught up in the endless iteration of one story idea. And those are the main things I would say. Oh, and lastly, structured time that you always give to writing. So you don't make that decision, should I write or not write? Because I can tell you what, with that decision facing you, you always say, no, I'm not going to write, it's too hard. But if you always say, look, on Tuesday mornings, I've got the morning clear, always on Tuesday mornings I'm going to write, or else I'll feel terrible afterwards. And so every Tuesday morning, you don't have to make a decision, you just write. So in other words, you fit into your schedule your writing time and live by that.
How do you pay the rent while you're learning to be a writer?
Oh, don't depend on writing for money. No, that's not a good motive. Writing is about being that telephone operator and of making something like an Andy Goldsworthy, like making a vase or a potter's wheel. You make these things for the fun of doing it and for the beauty afterwards and maybe please somebody. It is an absolute accident that people make money at fiction writing. It happens to about 1 out of 500 people who begin writing. And those people are not the best writers. They just accidentally fell into something.
You had another question?
Yeah.
Yes. What inspired you to write science fiction in the first place? And did you originally have sort of doubts that your family sort of tried to sway you in another direction?
I started writing science fiction because I grew up in California. And in California, when I grew up, was a strange combination of a utopian beach story and a dystopian, military-industrial complex. And so when I ran into science fiction, it was the first time that I felt like the reality that I grew up in, because I grew up also in an agricultural community of orange groves. It was completely orange groves when I grew up, and then by the time I was out of high school, it was completely what's there now. That was a very rapid transformation from agricultural to industrial, and then I ran into science fiction, and I said, that's what this is the best literature for describing the way reality feels that I've ever run into. And I was sold at that point. It was late for most science fiction people. I was about 18 or 19. It was a late discovery because in my library, the science fiction came after the rest of the literature. It had the spaceship and radar figure on it, spines, and it came after the Z's, and I was a very methodical reader. I started at A, I got to Z and went to college, so I never discovered science fiction until later on. What can I say? I'm a methodical guy.
Stan, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Stan will be signing books. Thanks for letting us into your world. It's good to see you again.
Yeah.